Hello and welcome to the Chan Podcast. I'm your host, Heather Gyron Fritz. This podcast is focused on bringing compassion, healing, awareness, and nurturing for your mind and body and soul. We hope to inspire new ways of thinking and motivation around a variety of topics and experiences, and we hope you'll come along for an episode and stay for the journey. Welcome to the Chan Podcast. I'm Heather Gyron Fritz, the host, and we're talking today with Robert Cantor, an international recovery advocate who is addressing our opioid epidemic, and lots of great information that's going to be shared. Welcome, Robert.
Thank you. Good morning, and it's an honor and privilege to be here. Thank you for having me on your podcast show.
Good morning, and you're welcome. I wanted to start off because I think it's important that the audience knows a little bit about you and your journey that brought you to this. It's a little bit similar, that it includes your child and mine includes my child, but you have a history as well. So can you tell our listeners a little bit about yourself and what brought you into this really important work?
Yeah, so I am in recovery from AUD and SUD, which we call alcohol use disorder, or we call it AUD, SUD, alcohol use disorder and substance use disorder. And we don't use the other language because of the stigmatization that occurs with that. So there's a big movement to change the language whenever we discuss this topic. My daughter as well suffers from the exact same things, except or her drugs of choice were heroin and opiates. So three and a half years ago, she almost overdosed. She was locked in an apartment with her drug dealing boyfriend, and we just couldn't get through to her. And as my only child, sleepless nights and so forth. There is something known as the Portugal model. Let me start by saying that years ago, our government declared a war on drugs. They tried to punish the problem away. It was very political, and it was a colossal failure, because we've learned that AUD and SUD are diseases, and they should be treated as such and be treated with compassion, with boundaries, but with compassion. And so the opposite of that is what the country of Portugal did, and hence the Portugal model. They had a very serious heroin epidemic, I'm going to say about 20 years ago. They took addressing that out of their criminal system and put it into their Ministry of Health. And an individual that was caught, let's say, with a 10-day or less supply of drugs wasn't put in jail. They weren't incarcerated. They were required to appear in front of what's called a dissuasion committee. And that was an attorney, a social worker, I believe, and a physician, if I'm not mistaken. They worked with that individual. They gave them what's called harm reduction tools. They treated them with compassion. That we say they separated the illness from the individual. And they gave them resources. Here's where you can go for detox. Here's, kits you can use to, here's, can we contact your family? Here's where you can go for a home cooked meal. We want you to be well. Long story short, they reduced their epidemic by 75%. So they got it right. So when my wife at the time and I convinced my daughter finally through one of her friends to meet us at a diner to discuss this and to come from this approach, because we had stigmatized her, disowned her from the family, and accused her of it being a moral failing. She was a loser. She was a failure. And so we did the opposite. And we came from a place of compassion. We said, if you want, we'll drive you to detox. You are part of the family. She left. We were crying. We didn't know what was going to happen. My wife and I, and an hour later, she showed up with her belongings in a black garbage bag. And we drove her to detox. She detoxed there for 5 days. We drove her to rehab. And she went to sober living, and now, not too long ago, celebrated 3 years of sobriety. I also have been sober many years, and so I said to myself, am I just going to sit around with these gifts I've been given, or what am I going to do? How am I going to be of service? So I was invited to tell this story at a press conference when Senator Gillibrand, the senator from New York, introduced legislation for families called the Family Support Services for Addiction Act. That set off, when I spoke, a whole avalanche of different types of media coverage. First local media coverage, then I was quoted in the National Review, and on and on and on. And then I said to myself, you know, the leading advocates like Ryan Hampton, Tim Ryan, are not doing anything on the international level. Let's tell other countries what's being done here, what kinds of treatment, what kinds of funding, the latest research, what's evidence-based research, and so forth. So I spoke on Canadian national television, then that led to TRT World out of Turkey and Al Jazeera. And then that backtracked into a podcast for NPR, and I wrote for Psychology Today. So it's just snowballed. I don't really like to brag, but I just like to talk about the lineage of how this happened. And here I am, and I'm sober, my daughter's sober. I particularly like to speak to families about having that kind of loving, destigmatized conversation that my wife at the time and I had with my daughter. Her name is Sasha. And interestingly enough, of all the mediums that I have engaged in, television, radio, digital, podcasts have been the ones that where I've had the most response from family members contacting me. And interestingly enough, Heather, children, young adults in their late 20s, 30s of a parent that are suffering, that have been contacting me, that really just have no idea. We call systems navigation. How do you do this? It's not important what the substance is. It's important, what rehab do you pick? How do you navigate this called, parity laws? The insurance companies trying to throw you out after a few weeks. They don't pay for your treatment the same way that they pay for a heart condition or diabetes. So as much as the word has never been out there more about recovery and about different pathways of treatment, there are just so many people that have no clue how to deal with this. They don't know about a 12-step fellowship program or a support 12-step fellowship program. So that's how all of this evolved. And here I am, and I am still sober. My daughter's still sober, and we hit a very grim milestone of 100,000 drug overdose fatalities in this country, which the numbers, it's like every week I turn around and now the number went to 105,000. Like there doesn't seem to be any end in sight. And we had the perfect storm between the pandemic and between fentanyl, which is just brutal on the streets. It's not like back in my day. You know all about it, the potency of it, and there'll be something behind it, whether it's a comeback from meth or whatever the case is. What's wonderful is someone like yourself that has lived this experience and is giving back too by having conversations with someone like me to disseminate information and ultimately to help people, and to help people that don't help families and help individuals. And there are so many pathways to recovery. I mean, there's a company, I won't mention their name, but they were just funded with like millions of dollars, where they provide Suboxone treatment through telehealth. You can meet, you can have a telehealth session. They will write you a script, call it, or they will call, they will electronically send your script into the pharmacy, and you could pick it up, and you could basically, treat your illness at home, if that's what you want. If that's what you want. And of course, 12-step programs, and then there's neuroplasticity and brain mapping, and then there's an intersection of technology and treatment. And the buzzwords now are evidence-based. That's where the funding comes from Washington. Everything has to be evidence-based. The problem with that is it really excludes 12-step programs. There's never been more pushback on 12-step programs. I subscribe to 12-step program, as does my daughter, but it's not one size fits all, right? So here we are, and it's nothing short of a public health emergency. We need all the media coverage we can get. Like I did a podcast in in Vancouver, British Columbia is getting devastated by drug overdose fatalities. It's not just the United States. It's not just, what happened in West Virginia and the pill mills and all that. It's all over, and it doesn't look like there's going to be any relief in sight. Now, they're doing more in Congress than they ever done. The gentleman that spearheads most of the legislation, his name is David Trone.
Mhm.
He's a congressman from Maryland, I believe D3 is the coding. And he's head of a task force, and he really has put through a lot of legislation. In fact, he introduced on the Congress side the Family Support Services for Addiction Act. It flew through the House because of his clout, and now it's sitting in the Senate in what's called the HELP Committee, the Health, Education, Labor, and Pension Committee. And then we can get into
Okay.
co-sponsors. That's another thing I do. So that's how I got here. There's lots of lawsuits going on. There has been some victories recently, specific to the Sackler family, specific to the
Mhm.
drug distributors. And so I hope that answers your question.
That does. And I think that the Portugal model is so important because as I was listening to you talk and thinking of your journey with your daughter and my journey with my son, were night and day. So one, you had this long journey that you knew about. We had a week, we had an overdose on August 9th and then an overdose, a fatal overdose on August 17th. And when Chandler went into the hospital, he didn't see a social worker. He was never given a list of resources. He was never offered Suboxone. There was no harm reduction or care in our local hospital, which is a big hospital for this young 23-year-old individual patient who happened to come in with an overdose. And he struggled that following week. He went out, he looked for Suboxone unsuccessfully. He went to some 12-step programs, and he went on Tuesday, Wednesday, and Friday. And on Friday, his drug dealer recontacted him and he left the meeting 10 minutes in, went and bought, and then died that evening. So I really think that stigma plays into this story so horribly, both in our community and in our hospital systems. Because someone who's worked in behavioral health and education for 30 years, to see that the hospital gave no resources, no support, my mind immediately went to they stigmatized that he was just another addict to them.
Well, that's a good point, Heather. So the largest hospital network in New York State is Northwell Health. They have 40,000 employees, more or less, tons of hospitals and so forth. And the CEO is Michael Dowling, and I've spoken to him. He is involved in some substance use disorder programs that they have. They opened a new facility called Wellbridge, which is a research facility / inpatient facility and so forth, and it's very well funded. But you have so many layers of medicine that go into a hospital.
Mm-hmm.
I went in for hip replacement surgery last year. I made it very clear to my orthopedist, no narcotics, I can't take them. It's a death sentence for me. He was fine, but the attending physician came into my room before I was leaving and says, okay, Mr. Cantor, we have 14 oxys to give you. He had these little notes scribbled. He didn't know what the F he was doing. And then I was in the emergency room for another thing, for another ailment. Thank God I'm fine. And the attending doctor said, you want some Ambien to take home with you?
Yeah.
You have to be so on top of these, that it has to come top down, and you have to bear down on these CEOs and these chairmen and let them know that to not let up, because there are times they do their best, but to manage all the emergency room doctors, all the internists, and a lot of them are not educated on substance use disorder.
Right.
And there's a lot of holes in the cracks. And it sounds like your hospital. So I'm going to be volunteering for the head of addiction psychiatry at Weill Cornell, New York Presbyterian, very prestigious, large hospital network out here. What I'm volunteering for is their family consult program. This is where individuals that are in beds, in detox, can have someone to talk to, like myself, in recovery, to say, here's what you do. And that's why they started that program. So let's get input from those in recovery that can say, okay, you can talk to me. I know the drill. Here's what I did, and here's what your options are. That sounds like what the missing piece. So one of the missing pieces was for your son, may he rest in peace, if
Yes.
that kind of program was not in place, they need to have that. Like they need to like step up to the plate and get with the program, because
Hmm.
this is a public health emergency. So I don't know, what hospital is it, or was it?
It was Northwest Hospital, which is part of the University of Washington system. So it's a big system. I was I was just amazed, and I even double checked with my son's fiance because I wasn't there around the clock. And so a social worker could have slipped in when I wasn't there. And she said, no, he never had a social worker. And he was, it's frustrating because, and I've heard you say this on other podcasts, we stigmatize addiction, and the community has this picture of who an addict is.
No, Heather,
And
I want to respectfully disagree with you. See, this is
oh,
where
okay.
this is where I'm going to get passionate. This is where you're going to have to start editing out what I say if I start using the fuck word or whatever, because this is where I get angry. This is a
Hmm.
large, multi-million-dollar hospital network. If they are
Yes.
affiliated with a teaching educational institution, they know better. They know the
Yes.
latest
They do
research.
know
There's
better.
no excuses. You're going to get professors in there. They're going to teach about this. They know. There's just disconnect because there's so many layers. They're
Right.
not guilty of that. They're guilty of not putting more resources and education into what's happening on the streets now and programs. But there's so
Okay.
many layers. But when you want to talk about a large educational system, they better know what they're doing. They better know about the
Hmm.
latest research. They better know what programs. They better get their students out there on the front lines to see who's in the hospital, and to, bridge that disconnect so that they are in touch with what's really happening. That's
Right.
what you need to
Right.
do. It's a difficult task, and doesn't mean there aren't people in their hierarchy that don't care. They are compassionate. It's a big problem. It's just like
Yes,
with
it is.
Congress, it took so many decades for them to get on the ball and understand, wow, this really is, it's not a moral failing. It's not these, drunks in alleyways or on the Bowery. This can be my son or my daughter. This is the amount of the gross national product that is lost to substance use disorder, and so forth and so on. So my point being, there's a disconnect, but there's absolutely no excuse for them to not be more proactive.
Right.
Especially as I talk to you, the educational institutions, they're supposed to be right
Right.
on top of what's going on, more so than
Right.
the hospitals. They're more robotic, So now is where you're gonna have to start editing me out, because I get very passionate about this, and it pisses me off because your son, may he rest in peace, should be here, as well as
Hmm.
we talked about look up to Adam, the organization out here in Long
Yes.
Island. I met 50 women, same
Yeah.
story as yours. And I could go on and on in my 12-step meetings. I could go on and on and on. Well, something's
Right.
broken here.
Very broken.
And listen, I want to just say one other thing, and then I'll let you speak. When we talk about the opioid epidemic and who caused the opioid epidemic, or who is
Yes.
the main players, it's not the drug distributors, and it's not the physicians, and it's not Purdue Pharma. It is the Food and Drug Administration years ago, when they were corrupt, that did not. All of these other players just jumped along for the ride because of the money. But the Food and
Hmm.
Drug Administration did not do their job with proper oversight and proper marketing oversight and proper labeling. And then you had these commissioners of the FDA that were corrupt. Where do they go when they're done at
Hmm.
the FDA? They go to Big Pharma.
They go,
They
yes,
go to Big
yes.
Pharma. I mean, there's an excellent piece on 60 Minutes, if you search it on YouTube, that goes through this whole thing, and it goes through the individuals, and the Drug Enforcement Administration had their hands tied. They wouldn't let them prosecute these individuals. And then from there, the floodgates opened. And I'm not saying Purdue Pharma and the physicians and the pharmacists and the drug distributors and the pill mills are not culpable. They certainly are. But let's
Hmm.
not just point the finger at them. Do you see
Hmm.
this problem has just been such a problem for so long, and the
Yes.
casualties are and that's why I go back to the Portugal model, whereas they nipped it in the bud, they got it, they said no, let's tackle this now this way. not the president that said a war on drugs. And
Right.
let's fill out jails where they're not getting treatment. That makes sense. What's going to
Mm-hmm.
happen when they come out? Are they going to be cured? No, they're going to be punished. Treatment,
Right.
you don't punish away an illness. You don't say, oh, you have diabetes. Listen, you're pissing me off. Stop it. You're hurting my body. Stop it. Don't be diabetic. I mean, that's the
Right.
insanity.
Yes.
So anyway,
Yes.
that's very upsetting to me. If I hadn't been in the 12-step program and had a foundation of recovery, I could have popped those opiates when I had hip replacement.
Mm-hmm.
And as they say, shalom.
Well, I know I was talking to another guest on the podcast the other day about the M30s on the street here. We have M30s really big and they're all laced with fentanyl. And he hasn't used since 2017. And I asked him, do you still crave it? And he said, oh God, every day. And I said, well, what prevents you? And his logic was clear enough that he doesn't use because he knows they're laced with fentanyl. But if he could get his hands on something not laced with fentanyl, he'd be in trouble. And so I asked him about, I said, well, what about getting to a point where our community is becoming more tolerable to fentanyl? Is that going to happen? And he said it already is. People are already getting addicted to fentanyl, which is scary as heck, because that's when, what's going to come after fentanyl?
Okay, but here's the problem. You
Mm-hmm.
can have a young adult that says, oh, okay, my friend overdosed, I get it. But when they start getting high, whether it's heroin, whether it's smoking a joint, their decision making is clouded.
Right.
They want more. And so now who do they depend on? Of all the people, who do they depend on to make a good decision for them? Believe it or not, their drug dealer. They're going to a
Right.
drug dealer and they're saying, okay, give me good stuff. Don't put fentanyl in it. The drug dealer's like, I don't care. I want you to keep coming back. If fentanyl costs me nothing. They smuggle it in. It's in a
Mm-hmm.
little. That's the insanity, is that you lose that clarity of judgment.
Right.
So when you're sober, you're saying, yeah, no, let me stay away from fentanyl. It's lethal. But as you go on and on and on, when you need your drugs, you need that euphoric feeling. You're going to wherever you can get it. You're going to
Right.
go on the streets and sell your body if you have no money. So there's no rationale once you cross that line
Mm-hmm.
into, going from using it early in the evening, let's say, versus when you have to have it. I
Right.
mean, you always have to have it, but there's a point where it's enjoyable for a small amount of time, and then it becomes, a requirement. And when it's a
Right. Takes
requirement,
over.
yeah, you don't, it's going to be a very small population that's going to say, oh, okay, well, it's laced, I better stop. Well, unfortunately, it doesn't work
Right.
that way.
Right. And that's what I thought. I thought that his answer was very unique. You talk a lot about addiction being a family disease. Can you talk about that and what you mean by that when you say that?
We, in our 12-step program, we say that the people we hurt the most are the people we love the most. And a person that is in the throes of their substance use disorder is a very sick individual. And their behavior affects everybody around them. It confuses them, it frightens them, and it shatters dreams. And many families, as I mentioned earlier, don't know how to handle this kind of situation. They also don't know what resources are out there. This toxic individual, this loaded gun, is right next to you. You're either living with him, you're married to him, it's your child, it's your parent. And I don't know, it's like having a landmine in your apartment or house, never knowing when it's going to go off.
Right.
And they're stealing, and they're bringing, drugs into your home, and they're losing jobs, and they're calling you. I mean, all the devastation that goes with substance use disorder is being thrown on those individuals that are right there. So they make them sick. They make them very sick, and they scare the daylights out of them. And unless they're properly educated, and there's a lot of what I talk about, and unless they have boundaries and unless they have their own support network, they're going to get sick. It is a family disease. The people we hurt the most are the people we love the most. It'd be great if they could be locked in a room and say, hey, don't come out, you handle it. Doesn't work that way. This is a family member where you have an emotional connection to them, and they're sick and they're acting in very, very destructive ways. and it's destroying everything around them. We like to
Right.
destroy relationships. We're really good at that. Are really good at destroying every important relationship in our lives. My daughter destroyed a relationship with me, and before that, I destroyed my relationship with her when I was active and she wasn't. It's a, you know, and but there's help for the families as well. That's the good news.
Yes. Yes. I think I've heard the statistic that for every addiction, the individual affects it. It was either one or nine others with their addiction at a minimum. That's at a minimum. And it's really sad because, like you said, families don't know where to go for help. But you also have a list of resources that you've given to me, and I've heard you share on other podcasts. What are some of the great places that people can go to that have good information out there for them?
There's a number of different layers to that. And I would always start local. And I would start
Yeah.
local with community organizations that deal with substance use disorder. I would definitely focus on ones that have support groups for families. We have one out here called Thrive, where you can go and be right in a support group. There's also 12-step meetings there as well. And there's, of course, the 12-step. And I notice I don't mention them because they're anonymous programs, but there are 12-step programs specifically for families. You'll find them when you call. So your community organizations are free, and they're in your neighborhood or they're in your county, and you can lean on them for information and support. There are other systems navigate. The best thing that I always say is to go online and educate yourself and Google
Yes.
everything you can. Google reviews on inpatient programs, speak to other parents, speak to counselors at the school who have information on this. There are EAP programs at jobs where they can speak. If someone's at a job, they can go to their EAP counselor to talk about their husband. They can do that.
Right.
Right? So you have your EAPs, you have your psychiatrists, you have government agencies like SAMHSA, and there's so much out there. There is an organization in Washington that's very grassroots called Faces and Voices of Recovery, and you want to talk to them. There's Young People in Recovery, very large organization. I think they're out of Denver on the West Coast. These are grassroots kind of boots to the ground organizations. There are local drug facilities, inpatient facilities that you can call. You try to find the reputable ones and you ask them the questions, and they will have counselors that will talk to you. Absolutely. There should be individuals at the hospital that will talk to you, but it's going to require research, and go to your schools, go to government organizations, go to your community organizations, go to your therapist, go to your internist and say, I have, my child is struggling. Where should I go? What are my medical options? Tell me about substance use disorder. Tell me about Suboxone and Vivitrol. What are my goals? Be proactive, put all the pieces together. You can sit down with your loved one and say, listen, we do love you. We are on the same page. Speak their language, whatever the street language is. Let their eyebrows go up and say, oh, they know what's going on. There isn't a disconnect of generation where my mother doesn't know what's happening on the streets. Let them know you've done research and that you want to help them. Here's the research. It's up to you. You want to act on it. You know, you're the sick one here. We support you. We know where the resources are. We'll go with you for a counseling session at an inpatient facility. We called X, Y, and Z inpatient. I've talked to some people, they're reputable. They will allow us to go visit with them and speak to them before being admitted. They'll definitely do that. They have intake individuals. They're not going to say, make a decision and come or don't come. No, they're people that want to help out there. But, there's a lot of work to be done. It really should be done, just to clarify, this work should be done for the person that's suffering. They have to do their own homework. They're not going to say, Mom, okay, do all the work. Let me know. I'm going to be busy out on the streets. What I'm saying is you can be a support cog in their wheel and together work together, right? and educate yourself and say, listen, you want us to help you with, with rehab. You went to this one, you didn't stay at your 12-step meetings, you didn't finish your Suboxone. There's nothing more we can do for you. This is what's out there
Right.
for you, honey. There's a fine line between enabling and helping.
Mm.
When you
Mm-hmm.
build a support network of other parents, of other husbands, you'll find that fine line. See,
Mm-hmm.
like I could say,
Mm-hmm.
go out and do all the research you want and be on, but then the question is, what's the difference between enabling and just having information?
Right.
And it's not like I spoke to so and so, give them a call. It should be like, here's who you call, and you speak to the social worker. You find out who it is, and you do it. You know, there are 12-step meetings. Go call the intergroup office of the 12-step organization in your town. You find out where the meetings are. You write them down, and we'll give you a ride if you want, but you go in there. We're not going in there. You know what I mean? It's such a fine
Right.
line,
Right.
but you want to
Yes,
be
it is.
involved, but you don't want to enable.
That's very true. I think as I was listening to you, my first reaction was, well, what individual that has an addiction is going to go and do that? And then I got to the point where I thought, but then if they're not going to go do that, they're also not going to go to the resource. Where if they get to the point where they are looking up the resource, it's more likely they're going to follow that resource, follow
Listen,
through with it.
you don't, for every 27-year-old that's active, he's got 20 friends that are active, and he
Yes.
might have two that are sober. They'll let him know
Mm-hmm.
where to go. They'll let him know what inpatient, they'll let him know what sober homes, they'll let him know where to go. The information's
Mm-hmm.
out there. They're not stupid.
Mm-hmm.
They're living in this life, and they're going to cross. Not every single person, a 27-year-old who's using opiates, is going to be in the throes of it. There are going to be some that got better, or they're going to be some of
Right.
his friends whose brother got better or sister got better. They know the deal. They know what's out there.
Right.
They're not
Right.
living under a rock. At the end of the day, you can't force them. You can't punish the problem away. You do your research. You get your support network in place, and you throw a few prayers in there
Mm-hmm.
if that's what you do.
Right. Let's talk a little bit about gratitude. I've heard you mention that too. And I think that, there's times in my work that it's been 2.5 years and I still will break down and be upset that I've lost my son and wonder why he's not here to help me with this journey. And being grateful comes in little spurts for that when you've lost your child. But I think there are a lot of things that I am grateful for. And I know I've heard you mention your gratitude in life and where you are now and where your daughter is now. And I think that's an important part of moving forward. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Gratitude connects with service. And when I'm wrapped up in myself and I'm worried about the job or the finances or the girlfriend or whatever, I'm not thinking about how fortunate I am. When I'm
Hmm.
fortunate, I'm like, okay, well, where's my service? Look at all the great things I have. Okay, I'm sober, my daughter's sober, and then there's a gap between everything else, the finances, the job. All right, so I'm really grateful. Wait a minute, that's wonderful, but what about you giving back to someone that's suffering
Hmm.
here? When I'm
Hmm.
not in that space of gratitude, I'm not doing service. I'm wrapped up in my own life. And so the challenge is to stay in a place of gratitude. Well, for me, guess what? This is how I gain gratitude. And by gaining
Hmm.
gratitude and seeing a smile on your face or helping someone, then I'm prompted to keep doing service. And by the way,
Yes.
they say you talk about the shame, you take the power out of it. And one of the
Yes.
most important things is, like, you're very candidly talking about your loss. It's a very, very difficult thing. By the way, may Chandler rest in peace. Um, I'm not thrilled to share that I went bankrupt or whatever happened or I sold my body. But that's the cathartic part of it. Why? Because you're helping other people.
Right.
Anyone that comes to a 12-step program has the shame of all their behaviors. But when they see someone else openly sharing about it, they're like, oh, wow, maybe I could do that. Oh, wow, I'm not the only one that sold my body on the street. Or oh, wow, maybe this is a kind of person I should be speaking to about this. Like, how did they find the courage to get up there and talk about running out of money for drugs and selling their body to get money, selling their body, selling sex for, you know what I mean? Because this is the reality of what us people do. We don't do
Hmm.
very, very stand up, classy, commendable things when we're in the throes of this. We do what we have to do. We'll sell off the possessions, we'll steal from you,
Hmm.
this is what we do. So they're connected, the gratitude and the service piece. And you notice how it's cyclical, right? You do service, you get gratitude. If you stay in
Right.
gratitude, you do service. And again, I keep going back to the 12-step model because that's what I subscribe to. The culmination of the work we do there is to make sure that there's gratitude and that you're giving back service. That's also the cyclical part of that model of recovery, is to make sure you arrive at a place of gratitude and service. And that will
Hmm.
prompt you to extend your hand, just like the person extended my hand to me when I first came around and I was sick. I can then be there to do the same thing for the next person that's going to walk through that door, or that's going to call
Right.
me, or that's going to, do these things. And then, by the way, a parent can also get involved by doing service, by going to an organization that wants someone to man the hotlines. Or they
Right.
can do something like I'm doing. People, volunteering is a great way, is a cathartic way to heal and to give back.
Hmm.
So
Hmm.
that's also a proactive way for someone to be of service and to, and every loss, there is gratitude to be had. Sometimes it's hard to sift through
Right.
what's happened to get to it. It's easier for some and difficult for the others, but there's always stuff to be grateful for.
Hmm. I agree. I know that's when I started the concept of the Chan project just months after Chandler passed, and then COVID hit. And so it really stalled us. And we're now going forward really strong. And we're run completely by volunteers and interns. And I'm just, every day, I'm so grateful and I'm amazed at how many people this work draws in. How many people come knocking on the door? Can I volunteer? Can I intern? It's amazing how many lives have been touched with a personal experience of either a loss or an addiction, or a child of an addiction or something, and they all want to give back, and it just spreads that gratitude and spreads that just that love for healing to the community.
Yeah. And again, the, just by having this discussion and letting people know, you can get involved. And
Right.
that getting involved and interacting with other individuals affected by this issue is a tremendous educational opportunity. Like,
Hmm.
throw yourself in, get involved, get in there, get in those support programs, because it will also make that family member healthier.
Right.
you
Right.
know so so that's part of what I talk about. I talk about recovery, I talk about what's happening, let's say, in Congress. I talk about lawsuits and the Sackler family and lawsuits with the distributors. I talk about what's happening in other countries. I talk about recovery resources, and then I talk about my story.
Hmm.
um, which, again, my daughter and I did a podcast. We did one podcast together,
Mm.
and it's like when I hear these 20-year-olds talking recovery, I'm like, my jaw drops. Like,
Yes.
where the hell did you learn this? Because I was just getting started when I was in my late 20s.
Right.
It's like, wow, that's why they're, and I tell her, you're such an important power of example for others to know that, someone their age
Hmm.
is sober,
Hmm.
But listen, most people don't get sober. Most people don't, and it's a thin line. And I'm not going to be foolish to believe that, that me and my daughter are set for life. Doesn't work that way.
Hmm. Hmm.
Life happens, illness happens. There's no guarantees here. There's no guarantees. Drug dealers aren't going anywhere.
Right. Let's talk a little bit to that, because I think that that's really important information too, is that the statement is always out there that relapse is part of recovery. And as a parent, you always want to say, well, you don't have to relapse, but statistics say relapse is part of recovery. And that relapse pulls in that shame. And so what's your advice for people who do relapse? How do they get through that and come back out without saying, well, now I've relapsed, I might as well just throw it all in?
Most people relapse. That's number one.
Mhm.
Absolutely. Because it's not easy to go against the getting sober for someone that suffers from AUD, or getting clean, as they say, someone that suffers from SUD, is, if not the hardest, one of the hardest things they will ever do in their lifetime.
Mhm.
For most of us, it is the absolute hardest, because it goes against the grain. We're programmed to drink and use drugs, and we're programmed
Right.
to use it, drink a lot and use a lot of drugs. That's what we're supposed to do. So when we go into recovery, we're reprogramming our brain to not do that. It's hard work. But whenever someone comes back in my group, someone just came back yesterday, they're fraught with shame. Okay.
Right.
And many people get caught up in their action of relapse as opposed to what they previously accomplished. And if they had 3 days sober, pat yourself on the back. For 3 days, you didn't engage in that bad programming. You didn't engage in that destructive behavior. Don't lose sight of what you did accomplish. To answer your question, you have to identify where you made the mistakes, whether you
Okay.
didn't finish your medication, whether you didn't go to your support group, whatever, and you must dive right back in and build your support network immediately. You can't do recovery a la carte. You can't
Right.
just pick and choose what's convenient for you. Most times it is not convenient. Most times
Mhm.
it doesn't feel good. And almost all times it's fear-based. It's frightening because you're
Right.
forced to change. I'd rather be doing drugs and feel euphoric and just chill. Why do I want to go and talk to people about this and stop my euphoric feeling and all this stuff? We just have to get to a point where we want to get well more than we want to get drunk and high. So
Mhm.
be proud of what you've accomplished, dive right back in, replace the fear with the faith, lean on
Mhm.
people and your support network, but take it seriously and dive right back in. Don't if you've relapsed, it's very, very, very doubtful that you're going to get well by yourself automatically.
Right.
Substance use disorder doesn't go away. Now, I will tell you, there are rare cases where someone comes in and they hit, as we call, a bottom, and they go back out and they don't take any treatment and they live productive lives. It happens. It
Right.
can be
Right.
situational. Don't get me wrong. And I'm not a therapist and I'm not a psychiatrist. I've
Mhm.
observed it. I've observed it 1 out of 10,000 times, but it does happen, which
Right.
is a liability for someone suffering, because you don't want them to say to themselves, well, I have heard that people can just
Right.
come relapse and then I'll get well. That just almost never happens. So don't be ashamed of what you have accomplished. Correct the mistakes you made, and dive back into your recovery with both feet.
Right. And I think another important part is connection and community. I've heard quite a few people that I've talked with. They say the opposite of addiction is connection, and I know I think that's really true. I think that when you can build community, like you said a few times today, building that network, having those friends that are like you in wanting to get clean or wanting to get sober. I think that that's really important.
And that's why the pandemic was so brutal. You lost that connection, that
Yes.
in-person connection. Um, we have a gentleman celebrating a few years of sobriety on Sunday. We call him our pandemic baby because he was able to get sober on virtual meetings. Um, but
Wow.
but I don't hear that often because, my gosh,
No.
and why? Because you're not accountable. You're not
Mm-hmm.
accountable. We don't see you at the
Mm-hmm.
meeting. We don't see you making your effort. The psychiatrist doesn't see you, coming for your appointments. Uh, you're not accountable. All right, well then, let me lean over here and do some heroin while I'm on this
Mm-hmm.
virtual meeting. No one's going to know, you know.
Right. Right.
Someone has to look you in the face and say, okay, what's up? Are you
Mm-hmm.
struggling? Or
Mm-hmm.
whatever. So, boy, it's such a problem, and it's such a serious problem, and
Yes, it is.
the stigma is such a problem, and politically it can be a problem, and
Mhm.
and funding can be a problem, and
Yes, yes,
it's a public health emergency. It's right along there with
it
COVID.
is.
It's
Yes.
right along there with COVID, and those numbers. I think it's been 500,000 overdose fatalities in totality since
Mm-hmm.
this problem
Mm-hmm.
started, but it's going to keep going.
Right.
So who knows
It
where the
will.
numbers, it could be end up more than COVID. Not that that matters, but it's at the level of the
Right.
pandemic. In a way, you could call it it's a pandemic in its own way, because
It
it's
is.
just not. Yeah.
It is, and I think that one of the this is my observation. I think that one of the things that has really skyrocketed is well, it's dual, but it both has to do with the pandemic. Is that it came out of the media when the pandemic went into the media, and then we had the isolation from the pandemic, and I think those two together just it became backstage, and then it became isolation, and I think it's just
Well,
skyrocketed.
what about detox beds? Guess what happened to those beds when COVID came? They converted them
They,
to COVID beds.
right,
What do
right.
you think happened in inpatient rehabs? If there were three patients, I'll call them clients, in a townhouse or in an apartment, whatever it is, in a room. Now, when they had a new admit, that person had to be quarantined for 15 days.
Right,
Now they lost two beds. Now there's a
right.
backup for individuals wanting to get into detox and rehab, in inpatient rehab.
Hmm.
Not good. Not
No,
good.
no. Well, hopefully we
So
are seeing a disintegration of this COVID pandemic and crossing my fingers that we get back to a better space of getting the knowledge of the opioid epidemic out there and paid more attention to and cross my fingers. I don't have a lot of faith in our political system, but I would love us to adopt something like the Portugal model. I think that it's extremely important. I think that that belief and that support is needed so widely. And all I can do is cross my fingers.
listen, Heather, just keep up the great work. And it's great that you're getting these young adults involved. I love to see
Hmm.
that. They're on the front
Yes,
lines. They're the ones that
yes,
really speak the language and know what's happening.
yeah,
They're basically all. You have to be living in under a rock if you're 26, 23, 32, and you don't have a friend that's suffering, or
right,
that you've lost. I hear it all the time,
yeah,
all the time. I mean, it's just it never stops, and it does shake people up. There's no question. It's traumatic for them. Some use that to find their way into a pathway to recovery, and some
hmm,
don't. It doesn't phase them because they think they're invincible. But
right,
they know Jay Lee, who's a sweetheart, who's volunteering her time. She
hmm,
talked very interesting about substance use disorder in the on the reservations, I believe, in the
yes,
Native
yes.
American. That's a
She
very
lives up on
interesting
the
topic.
yeah,
You should really, I suggest that you might want to just do a podcast on that specific issue, because
yes,
that's something that I need to be more educated about. I would love to hear from someone in that community. See, I'd like to be educated and love to hear individuals who come from other countries to hear how SUD permeates their culture. That's
yes,
really
yes,
interesting to me. And Native Americans live in our backyard, right? They're in this
right,
country. I would like to know how it affects them. I'd like to know culturally, how stigmatizing is it there? What kinds of treatments do they have access to? Are there members or people, whatever word you want to use? Are the individuals in their community seeking out treatment? Do they need people to come in there to bring the message in there and educate them? I could
right,
see where, you have the elders that are considered the wise ones, and they grew up where you don't touch drugs, that talk about stigma. And so the younger members of this community say, I'm not going to go to, the elder and ask him about this. He would be insulted if I brought this topic
Right.
up. You know what I'm
Right.
saying? There's a whole thing with Jay Lee, I think, that you could dive into there that would be of great interest
Yes.
to
And
your
we
listening
actually, one
audience.
of my other interns, she does work with the health department there on the tribe. So, and she is going to be a guest on the podcast. So that's a really good idea to pull in her knowledge about how the tribe is managing and handling and dealing with. We'll do that. We'll do that for you, Robert.
Fantastic. Well, I hope I've been helpful in
You
to your
have.
audience.
It's been a very rich conversation, a lot of information out there, a lot of helpful information that I think is going to help our listeners and the families that tune in. So thank you so much for meeting with me this morning and sharing your knowledge and your experience.
It's my pleasure to be here. Good luck on your journey, and really keep up the great work.
Thank you. Thanks so much for tuning in to another episode of the Chan Podcast. We appreciate you joining us and hope so much that you gained insight. We invite you to share with us what you enjoy about the episode and all of our stories, what you would like to hear more about, and to share your opinions and interests. Please glance over our show notes and be sure to check out the episode's blog, where you actually get a chance to dialogue with the Chan Project team and our guests directly. You can find this at chanproject.org/podcast, and then just select the show you tuned into. You can find all of our episodes on this same page and our full list of programs on chanprogram.org. Namaste, Heather and the Chan Podcast family.